In just a few minutes, I want to be able to give you just a quick rundown case for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I've made a much longer video on this that you can watch if you want some more details that back up the evidence that I'm going to kind of present before you, or the argument that I'm going to present before you. I would also encourage you to check out the work of Mike Licona, Gary Habermas. These guys are scholars, experts. I'm a pastor, but what I want to give you is a quick rundown of the case for the resurrection of Jesus so that you might be able to kind of tuck that away in your pocket as something to use to be able to explain the reason for your hope to others. So we have to first consider the basic facts that we're dealing with when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. First, there's a resurrection because Jesus was killed. Jesus was killed on the cross. The disciples were terrified by everything that transpired. And even when Jesus was arrested, they had run away from him. 3 days later, the tomb was found empty. And then after that, the disciples suddenly became bold in their witness. Now, this witness that the disciples gave was that they saw, touched, talked with Jesus, raised from the dead. And so when we think about what the disciples went through for the sake of that witness, suffering, dying on the basis of that testimony, we have to keep those things in mind. They were not claiming that they just had a vision of Jesus. They claimed that they actually saw him, all of them together. And so, having that in mind, what their testimony is, and those basic facts that I just related to you, we can consider alternative explanations, whether they would be sufficient for explaining the empty tomb. The first explanation that might be offered would be called the swoon theory. This is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die. It just seemed like he died, or as in the Princess Bride movie, he was mostly dead. So when they put him in the tomb, Jesus isn't actually dead. He resuscitates and he appears to the disciples. Now, the problem with this theory, of course, is you have to deal with the question of, well, how did he get out of the tomb if he was in such a bad condition that it seemed as though he was dead? And then we also have to consider that once he appeared to his disciples, he wouldn't have been a very inspiring sort of visage. He would have been beat up, bloodied, kind of escaped death by the skin of his teeth. Certainly wouldn't have transformed the disciples from being fearful to suddenly being courageous and claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. And then we'd also have to consider that eventually Jesus would die again, and so there should be a body on our hands someplace. So that theory doesn't seem the best explanation for the empty tomb. Another explanation that is offered is that, well, Jesus' body was stolen from the tomb. Now, when we suggest that his body may have been stolen from the tomb, the first question we have to ask is, well, who would have stolen his body? If it was enemies of Jesus, maybe the Jewish religious leaders, the Romans, once the disciples found the tomb empty and began making these claims that he was risen from the dead, all they would have had to done is just simply produce the body or say, we threw it in the ocean or something like that. That's not what we find. And so if that doesn't really add up, then we might consider, well, maybe it was just someone else, just someone random. They don't know who stole Jesus' body, whisked his body away. The disciples found it empty. Even so, we have to reckon with the fact that the disciples claimed that they actually saw Jesus. Again, that they touched him, talked with him, ate with him. And so what would inspire them to make those sorts of claims, being willing to die for those sorts of claims, even when they would know that they were entirely false? Along the same lines, it might be suggested that the disciples themselves stole the body, which would just make that even worse because they would literally know that Jesus was not risen from the dead at all. He was absolutely dead. They just wished his body somewhere else. So the stolen body theory doesn't really do a great job in explaining the facts that we're dealing with here. Jesus died, empty tomb. All of a sudden, the disciples are making these claims and they're no longer fearful. Well, some might suggest, well, maybe the disciples experienced a hallucination. They had a vision of Jesus, and so that's why they claimed that he was risen from the dead when he actually wasn't. Now, again, the testimony that they give is very tangible, that they actually touched Jesus, that they ate with him. What's most problematic about the hallucination theory, though, is that hallucinations are individual experiences. They're not a group phenomenon. And what we see again and again in the gospel accounts is how Jesus doesn't just appear to individuals, but actually to groups of people. And so it's impossible that they would have all had the same hallucination. And eventually, you would have found some person that would say, wait a minute, you guys are saying that you're seeing Jesus is not here in the room. And in fact, we see the example of the disciple Thomas, who wasn't present when Jesus first appeared to his disciples and refused to believe until he put his hands on Jesus himself. So the hallucination theory doesn't really seem the best explanation either. Which again just leads us back around to considering, well, maybe the disciples made it up. But when we consider that possibility, it just becomes less and less feasible when we realize there was nothing for them to gain from it. They didn't have anything monetarily to gain from making that claim. They couldn't have known the future in which they would have become worldwide known figures, very famous, powerful. They didn't see that in their lifetimes. They didn't enjoy any sex benefits from it. That's what we see a lot of times in cult religious groups, that the leaders try to use their positions to gain sexual benefits. We don't see that with the disciples at all. They had nothing to gain from making these claims and everything to lose, their very lives. And so, considering the basic facts, Jesus died, the tomb was found empty. All of a sudden, the disciples are giving this testimony. They've completely changed their tune in terms of being no longer afraid, but now bold. And when we consider that the other explanations just don't add up as sufficient theories for explaining the empty tomb, all of it points to the fact that the resurrection is the best explanation. And this becomes all the more clear when we consider, well, what do the scriptures have to say in foretelling that the Messiah would be raised from the dead? Jesus himself told the disciples that this was going to occur, even while they didn't seem to be able to put the pieces together until it actually happened. Now, some of you even may be like, well, we just can't consider that explanation. And if you're in that position, I'd suggest it's because you're probably prejudiced against the possibility of the supernatural altogether. That would be known as a naturalist position. The position of assuming that the only things that happen in this world, all the things that happen, they can only be explained by natural causes. But if you're going to make that claim, then that brings us into the realm of considering just the existence of God itself. And I could dive into arguments for that, but that would make this a much longer video. But all you have to consider is that if God exists, then miracles are possible. The supernatural is possible. He brought the world into existence. He created the world. He can certainly raise Jesus from the dead. And so, if you welcome that possibility of the supernatural and we examine the evidence, everything points to the reality that Jesus is alive. He's been raised from the dead. And so, if he has been raised, then we must consider, what does that mean for our world? And if Jesus is alive, what does it mean for your own life? Hey, thanks for watching this video. I encourage you to like it, subscribe to the channel to get more content like this. If you live in Rhode Island or the surrounding areas, I encourage you to visit us at Rockland Community Church, where I have the privilege of being pastor. If you want to learn more about the resurrection, check out the link down in the video description where I go over all the evidence in a much longer seminar. Really encourage you to reflect on this evidence and to consider believing that Jesus has in fact been raised from the dead. Catch you in the next video.